I caught my girlfriend cheating with my stepfather. They turned it around and convinced my entire mom that I'm lying to extort money from him. The memory of that night still makes my stomach churn. I'm 28, and my girlfriend, Lisa, is 26. We'd been dating for nearly 3 years. My stepfather, Greg, is 54, married to my mom, Ellen, for 5 years. It was late when I got home, long past midnight. I'd left Lisa at my place while I attended a friend's party. Something about the night felt off, so I decided to leave early and surprise her. But the surprise was all mine. The first thing I noticed was her shoes by the couch. Normal. What wasn't normal was the faint sound of muffled laughter drifting from upstairs. My chest tightened, and I crept up the stairs, each step heavy with dread. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe she was on the phone, or maybe it was just the TV. But as I approached my bedroom, I recognized the low murmur of a voice I knew far too well, Greg's. When I pushed open the door, I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. There they were, Lisa and Greg, half-dressed, scrambling to cover themselves. The room seemed frozen in time. Lisa's face twisted in panic, and Greg, this man who had lectured me on respect and family loyalty, stared back at me with that pathetic deer-in-the-headlights look. What the hell? The words tore out of me, raw and disbelieving. Alex, wait! Lisa cried, clutching the blanket. I didn't want to hear it. Get out, I said, my voice trembling with rage. Both of you. Get out of my house. Lisa tried to stammer out an excuse, but I cut her off with a glare that made her think better of it. Greg had the audacity to mutter, "This is a misunderstanding. Get out. Now." They left in a hurry, Lisa still clutching the blanket as if it could shield her from what she'd done. Greg didn't say another word, just slunk out like the coward he was. As the door slammed shut behind them, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. The adrenaline drained out of me, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating ache. The next morning, I drove to my mom's house, the anger from the night before still coursing through me. I hadn't slept at all. My mind kept replaying the betrayal, the sheer audacity of what I'd walked into, and the look on their faces when they got caught. Greg's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, and that alone almost made me turn back. But I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation. I needed my mom to know the truth. When I stepped inside, the house smelled of coffee and cinnamon, comforting scents that felt completely out of place given the storm brewing inside me. My mom greeted me with a warm smile, completely unaware of the bomb I was about to drop on her. She motioned for me to sit in the kitchen, asking if I wanted coffee. I barely managed a nod. I tried to steady myself as she poured a cup, her back turned to me. How was I supposed to tell her? Greg was her husband, the man she had built her life with after losing my dad. I kept reminding myself that I had to rip the Band-Aid off, no matter how much it hurt. Before I could even start, Greg strolled into the kitchen. He looked completely at ease, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't been thrown out of my house the night before. The sight of him made my blood boil. He greeted me casually, his voice infuriatingly calm, as though we were just another family having breakfast. I didn't respond. I couldn't doubt my mom looked between us, picking up on the tension. She asked what was wrong, her face etched with concern. That's when I told her. I laid it all out, as clearly and directly as I could. I told her how I'd come home early and caught Greg and Lisa together in my bedroom. I described the way they scrambled when I opened the door, the pathetic excuses they tried to throw at me, and how I'd thrown them both out of my house. My mom's face twisted with confusion and disbelief. I could see her struggling to process my words, to reconcile them with the man she thought she knew. Greg didn't miss a beat. He shook his head, letting out a dry laugh like what I just said was some kind of ridiculous joke. Then, in a voice dripping with fake disappointment, he spun a story that made my head spin. He claimed I was lying. According to him, I'd been struggling with money and had been pressuring him to help me out. When he didn't give in, he said I concocted this whole story to tear him down. As if that wasn't enough, Lisa, who had apparently come over early that morning, jumped in to back him up. She looked like she'd been crying all night, her eyes swollen and red. She played the victim perfectly, claiming she had no idea why I would make up something so cruel. It was like watching a perfectly orchestrated performance. They didn't even hesitate, feeding off each other's lies and manipulating the narrative until I could see my mom start to doubt me, And then it hit me, they had planned this. They'd spent the night figuring out how to spin the situation in their favor, and now they were turning the people I loved most against me. I tried to defend myself, to make my mom see the truth. But with every word I said, Greg and Lisa twisted it further. Greg leaned into his role as the betrayed stepfather, while Lisa painted me as some bitter, unstable boyfriend trying to ruin their lives. The worst part was watching my mom's face as the doubt crept in. She didn't outright accuse me of lying, but I could see the cracks forming. She didn't know who to believe, and it broke my heart. I left her house that morning feeling more isolated than I ever had in my life. To make sense of how things spiraled so quickly, I need to explain the dynamics in my family and my relationship. My mom married Greg 5 years ago, a few years after my dad passed away. I'll admit, I was wary of him at first. Greg was charismatic, the type of guy who could charm his way into any situation. He owned a successful business, and always presented himself as a family man who wanted to take care of my mom. She was happy with him, so I tried to accept it. Our relationship was distant but civil. Greg made a few efforts in the beginning, inviting me to golf or offering business advice, but those attempts felt performative, like he was ticking boxes to appear like a good stepfather. I never really trusted him. Lisa and I had been together for almost 3 years. I met her through a mutual friend, and our relationship moved quickly. She was funny, confident, and seemed to bring out the best in me. Or at least that's what I thought. Looking back, there were signs that something was off. Lisa and Greg got along too well. At family dinners, she would laugh a little too hard at his jokes or lean in a little too close when they talked. I brushed it off as her trying to fit in with my family. At one point, I even felt relieved that she seemed comfortable around them, especially since Greg could be such a larger-than-life presence. But there were little things I couldn't ignore. Once, I came back from grabbing drinks at a family barbecue and saw Greg's hand lingering on Lisa's shoulder. They both laughed when I walked up, like I'd interrupted a private joke. Another time, I caught her texting him, supposedly about some surprise she was planning for me. I confronted her about it once, but she turned it on me, saying I was being paranoid. "He's like a father figure," she said, her voice dripping with indignation. "How could you even think something like that?" It made me feel guilty, like I was projecting my own insecurities onto her. But now I see it for what it was, the start of a betrayal I didn't want to acknowledge. As for Greg, there were always whispers about him, rumors about affairs and inappropriate behavior with women who worked for him. My mom dismissed them as jealous gossip. She trusted Greg completely, and he made sure to maintain that trust by playing the perfect husband in public. I don't know if deep down I always knew something like this could happen. Maybe I ignored my gut because I didn't want to see the cracks. But now, those cracks have become a chasm, and I'm the one falling into it. After leaving my mom's house, I decided I couldn't subject myself to Greg and Lisa's manipulation any longer. I blocked them both on everything: calls, texts, social media. I wanted no part in their twisted narrative. But cutting them off didn't mean the damage stopped. Greg wasted no time spreading his version of events to the rest of the family. He was smart about it, using his charm and calm demeanor to paint me as an unstable liar. He claimed I'd been struggling with money and had fabricated the whole thing to extort him. Lisa played her role perfectly. She told anyone who would listen that I had become erratic and possessive in our relationship, that my accusations were born out of jealousy. It was infuriating, but I refused to engage. I knew their lies would only grow if I gave them anything to twist. The fallout was worse than I could have imagined. Family members started reaching out, cautiously trying to get my side of the story. I could hear the doubt in their voices. Some even asked outright if I had really been struggling with money and made it all up. I stopped responding to most of them. What was the point? The more I tried to defend myself, the more I felt like I was sinking in quicksand. Greg and Lisa had already poisoned the well, and I didn't have the energy to claw my way back up. One day, I got a call from my aunt, who had always been close to my mom. She said Greg had organized a family meeting to address the situation and thought it would be good for me to attend. "Alex," she said, her tone full of forced neutrality, "you should come. Greg just wants to clear the air. If this is all a misunderstanding, this would be the time to work it out." I nearly laughed at the suggestion. A misunderstanding? I told her I wasn't going, that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for what I knew was true. You're making yourself look guilty by avoiding this, she said before hanging up. But I didn't care. I knew what would happen if I went. Greg would put on his reasonable stepfather act, Lisa would cry, and I'd be ganged up on. I wasn't walking into a trap they'd set. My mom didn't call to invite me to the meeting, which stung more than I wanted to admit. It was clear where she stood, or at least how much influence Greg had over her. From that point on, I stayed away from everyone except a few friends who knew me well enough to trust my side of the story. I stopped going to family events, skipped birthdays, and avoided holiday gatherings. Every connection I had to that part of my life felt tainted. I'd like to say I didn't care, but the truth is, it broke me. Watching my family, people who had known me my whole life, side with Greg and Lisa over me was like losing them all at once. I was alone, and they had made sure I stayed that way. The weeks after I cut off contact were some of the loneliest of my life. My mom stopped reaching out altogether, which hurt more than I could admit. I guess I had clung to some small hope that she would see through Greg's lies, that she'd remember who I was and believe me. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, I realized that wasn't going to happen. Greg and Lisa had done their job well. They made sure I looked like the villain, and now I was the outcast. My family wasn't huge, but we'd always been close enough: holidays, birthday dinners, occasional weekend barbecues. Now all of that was gone. I tried not to check social media, but every once in a while I'd slip. My cousin posted pictures of a family dinner, my mom and Greg smiling together at the table. Lisa was there too, sitting right next to Greg, laughing like she belonged. Seeing them all together, carrying on as if nothing had happened, made me sick. I wasn't just angry, I was hurt. These were people who had known me my entire life, who should have had my back. But instead, they chose to believe a man who'd only been in the family for 5 years and a girlfriend who clearly had no loyalty to anyone but herself. There were nights I'd sit alone in my apartment, replaying everything in my head. I'd think about all the moments I missed, all the warning signs I ignored. I'd wonder if I could have done something differently to stop this from happening. But the truth was, nothing I did would have mattered. They were better at lying than I ever was at proving the truth. I tried throwing myself into work, keeping busy so I wouldn't have time to dwell on what I'd lost. My friends were supportive, but even they didn't fully understand. They'd tell me to move on, to stop letting it get to me. "You're better off without them," one of my friends said. "If they can't see the truth, they're not worth it." She was right, but it didn't make it any easier. How do you just move on from losing everyone you thought you could count on? I thought about reaching out to my mom again, maybe writing her a letter or calling her late at night when Greg wouldn't be around. But every time I picked up the phone, I stopped myself. If she hadn't believed me the first time, why would she believe me now? The isolation was crushing, but in some ways, it was freeing too. Without Greg and Lisa's manipulations, I could finally start piecing myself back together. Slowly, I began to rebuild a life that didn't revolve around them, or my family, but the bitterness stayed. No matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had stolen something from me that I would never get back. For weeks, I tried to stay strong in the face of everything, but the weight of it all kept pressing down on me. I wasn't looking to play detective or dig for proof. I just wanted someone to listen, to understand what I'd been through. I avoided family events entirely. The idea of sitting in the same room as Greg and Lisa, or worse, watching them act like nothing had happened, was unbearable. A few relatives reached out, but their words felt hollow. They wanted me to move past it, to keep the peace, as though their comfort mattered more than the truth. Eventually, I decided that the only person who really mattered was my mom. No one else's opinion would change how I felt, and deep down, I still hoped she'd come around. I waited weeks before reaching out to her again, hoping the dust might settle enough for her to see things clearly. When I finally called, she sounded guarded but not hostile. It gave me a sliver of hope. We met at her house, just the two of us. I went over everything, what I'd seen, how Greg and Lisa had twisted it, how isolating it had been to feel abandoned by my own family. I didn't yell or accuse. I just laid it out as plainly as I could, hoping she'd hear the pain in my voice and understand. But instead of the validation I craved, I got more of the same. "Alex," she said, her tone cautious, "this has been hard on everyone. I don't think Greg would do something like that. Hearing her say those words felt like a slap. "You're really going to believe them over me?" I asked, my voice cracking. She looked down at her hands. "Greg says you've been struggling, that maybe you misinterpreted what you saw. Lisa's heartbroken over what you've accused her of." "I don't know, Alex. Maybe it's all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I couldn't even process how she could say that after everything. I didn't argue. There was no point. The longer we sat there, the more I realized she wasn't going to change her mind. Greg had his claws in her too deep, and Lisa's lies had done the rest. When I left that day, I knew it was the last time I tried to talk to her about it. After that conversation, I stopped reaching out. I didn't make any dramatic announcements or start blocking people. I just let the silence grow. My mom never called to check in, and neither did anyone else in the family. It was like they'd written me off completely, which only confirmed what I already knew. They'd chosen Greg and Lisa over me. At first, it was devastating. I spent weeks feeling like I'd been hollowed out, like the people I loved most had turned their backs on me without a second thought. I kept wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I could have handled it differently. But the more time passed, the more I started to see it for what it was. It wasn't about me. It was about them, about their willingness to look the other way because the truth was too inconvenient. I started focusing on rebuilding my life without them. I leaned on my friends, who stuck by me even when my family didn't. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects to fill the empty spaces where family used to be. The pain didn't disappear overnight. It still lingers, like a dull ache that flares up when I least expect it. But I'm learning to live with it. I've accepted that my family isn't the safe haven I thought it was. And while I'll always carry the scars of what they did, what they refused to see, I won't let it define me. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most necessary. It's been months now since I've spoken to my family. The silence that once felt unbearable has become my peace. I don't check their social media anymore. I don't wonder if they'll call. I've learned to stop expecting closure from people who thrive on denial. Greg and Lisa don't occupy my thoughts the way they used to. They're just a chapter in my life, a painful one, but not the whole story. I've started focusing on what I can control, my career, my friendships, and the life I'm building for myself. Sometimes I think about my mom and what might have been if she'd chosen differently. But even that pain is starting to dull. Letting go of her, of all of them, has been the hardest lesson I've ever learned. But it's taught me something valuable. Family isn't about blood, it's about trust, love, and loyalty. And sometimes, the only way to protect yourself is to walk away.